The second audacity, sort of, I said that I did admire the framers and the founders in some regards. Well, how do I admire them? And I admire them for their willingness to just go for it. Even as I disagree with their solutions, even as I disagree with some of their motivations, I think there's still something very important to admire in the willingness to transform a political system. Let's return to those memes. This was a Scream joke I didn't make. Let's return to these memes, all right? When I'm admiring the audacity to take the Constitution, I like it. When I'm admiring the willingness to transform the political system, I like it. We don't talk as much. I don't remember it from school. I don't, my hunch is that you cover it somewhat in high school or whatever, but you don't really dwell in it. But we don't talk all that much about the circumstances around the Articles of Confederation. We have this progress-centered narrative of American history that kind of assumes that the Constitution is just going to happen, kind of the natural outgrowth, and we're progressing to it. But in fact, in the moment, no one knew that there was going to be a Constitution. The Constitution wasn't even the Constitution. It was just an alternative document to the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were understood by many Americans to be, this is our Constitution. This is what we sign, join together to achieve our independence. This is what the sacred agreement amongst us is. There were real problems with it. Congress was restrained basically by a series of supermajority rules. If it wanted to do anything, it needed a supermajority of the states to agree to it. If it wanted new powers to address unforeseen circumstances, it needed to get unanimous agreement to get those new powers, which is basically, there's no way to do that. If you got 10 college students in a room and said, we can only order pizza if all 10 of you agree, I don't know if it's going to happen. I'm not sure if 10 college students could agree on pizza. Not because pizza is bad or college students can't agree, but because no one can agree on anything unanimously like that. There's always going to be one dissenter. Even if they don't really mean it, they're still going to dissent. And that's more or less how the Articles work. There is 12 out of 13 states could say, we probably need to get this power to do this thing. And there'd be one state, usually Rhode Island, who said, no, I don't think we should do that. This is why they didn't ask Rhode Island to come to Philadelphia. There's a whole thing about Rhode Island being just like really recalcitrant and angry about the whole thing, and I think it's very funny. So the US government had all these problems that the Articles just couldn't address. The problems of debt. The US was in debt to foreign lenders, to soldiers, to public creditors. There's annual interest on the debt amounting to like $2.4 million in 1781 dollars, which I'm not sure how much that is in 2022 dollars, but I think it's a lot. It's a lot of money. I mentioned an economic crisis, I mentioned civil unrest. There is no real commerce power under the Articles. Congress couldn't directly tax, couldn't directly get money. It had to request from other states. It had to say, hey, do you mind chipping in some money to pay these things? And obviously, no, everyone was like, no, of course not. It couldn't deal with foreign powers effectively. And so we forget this since for more or less the past 130 years, the US has been like a continent-sized country. But those original 13 states were bounded basically by foreign powers. You had Spain and Florida, you had France and Spain in the Western territories. You still had the United Kingdom on the seas and in Canada. And then you had the native nations all on the borders. And there was a real fear amongst American elites that either some state will try in an attempt to get land or get advantage to ally with the foreign power, or attempts to get control of the Mississippi, attempts to get land for settlers will just spark a general war that the country simply couldn't afford and couldn't fight. And there was no way to do diplomacy centrally from Washington or from Philadelphia, or New York. I always forget where they were. The Confederation Congress is gridlocked on most issues, unable to handle its multiplying and overlapping crises, unable to do much of anything. But a cross-section of elites, here comes this other meaning of audacity, Most of the men you've heard of began to organize. You have James Madison in Virginia, sort of the central figure in all of this, who persuades the Confederation Congress to hold a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to kind of figure out, let's propose some amendments. This meeting adjourns and says we're going to have another meeting the following year in Philadelphia to really hash out what our amendments are going to be. And it was at that meeting that Madison and a bunch of his like-minded allies, Edmund Randolph, George Washington, George Mason, Ben Franklin, Robert Morris, Governor Morris, Alexander Hamilton, Rufus King, a bunch of guys, embarked on a plan to radically transform American government. And it's hard to get into the mindset of the time about how radical this transformation was. Because again, their mission, what they were told to do was come up with some amendments. What they did was create a whole new system of government. And a bunch of delegates left during the proceedings, essentially saying, I want no part of this because this isn't what we agreed to. And then once the product was produced, as I said, there was a great deal of opposition. I'm not going to go over all the details. In my view, what was even more audacious than this proposal for an entirely new system of government was the process they devised to actually pass it. There was a suggestion that we should let the various state legislatures, they should offer amendments, offer tweaks, see what people agree to. And the Federalists, Madison and his allies, were like, no, we're not going to do that. Not at all. Either you say yes or you say no, and that's it. And somehow everyone agreed to this. Everyone's like, okay, we'll do the up or down vote. We'll convene essentially independent legislatures drawn from the general population. We'll let people a unusually broad level of suffrage to choose conventions, and the conventions will give an up or down vote to the Constitution, and that's it. And it happened. And in a period of 2 years, a handful of elites and their supporters were able to completely reconfigure the basis of American government. And even though that plan, that document, couldn't hold the country together against its most violent pressures, it lasted much longer than any of them thought it would. There's a very excellent book about this, about how all the framers were pretty confident that by the time they were dead, this thing just wasn't going to work anymore. Except for Madison. Madison, always very hopeful, always very optimistic. But you should read John Adams' letters. He's just sort of he's complaining and moaning and whining. It's like, this is not going to work. There's no virtue in this society anymore. The kids are all terrible. It's not going to work. He might have been talking about his own son. It's kind of weird there. But there's real pessimism about its ability to work, but it survived for 80 years. And even in modified form, even with all of its problems, it has survived for 150 years plus. So that radical decision in 1787, I think even looks even more impressive in retrospect. The case I want to make to all of you, having said all of this, having said everything about the audacity of the founding, is that this is why the Founding Fathers matter. There's a lot of founder worship in the world. I don't like very much of it. There's a lot of attempts to present the Founding Fathers as unusually wise and unusually, intelligent and whatnot. And I just don't think that's the case. Setting aside the moral issues, you might say, about some of them, I think these were just ordinary men most of the time. There are a few of them that were genuinely perceptive. I mentioned Madison a couple times. I think Madison does stand out as an unusually perceptive person. But there are many unusually perceptive people, and there will always be many unusually perceptive people. When you think about what's called the second founding of Reconstruction, I can name several figures who I think share the same amount of wisdom, perception as some of the Founding Fathers did. I can think of people during the New Deal era who shared the kind of wisdom and perception that some of the Founding Fathers did. Civil rights era as well. Anytime you see major constitutional or cultural change, you will find people with levels of wisdom and levels of perception that match or surpass the Founding Fathers. So that's not what makes them impressive. That's not what makes them worth remembering or worth thinking about or worth paying attention to. What makes them worth paying attention to is just that audacity, that willingness to change a system that was not working for them. Their willingness to disregard the emerging worship of the Constitution that existed in favor of something that better attained what they wanted to do for their country and for the kind of republic democracy that they lived in. They rejected arguments for mere reform. They rejected arguments for small tweaks. They went full steam ahead with a radical revision of what they had. And for all of my problems with the Founding Fathers, I would be lying if I said that I didn't admire that deeply. That's the reason I keep reading about these guys, because I'm so fascinated in their psychology, because that actually is unusual, that willingness to take that big of a swing, not knowing how it's going to work out. I think Americans in this moment can identify all kinds of problems with our political system. Maybe you don't think that we should have a popular vote for president, but you might think that we shouldn't have gerrymandering the way we have it. Maybe you think that equal state representation in the Senate is fine, that every senator should get, every state should get 2 votes. But maybe you don't think we should just have a 2-party system. Maybe you think that's just not working for us. But for whatever reason, whether it's residual founder worship, whether it's the deification of the Constitution as some sort of like holy scripture, we are afraid as a country to have an open conversation about saying, hey, maybe we can do things differently. Maybe popular sovereignty, the thing that's supposed to give the Constitution its power, maybe popular sovereignty isn't dead. Maybe constitutional meaning belongs to us and not a bunch of judges and not a bunch of politicians, but us, the people for whom this thing is supposed to be our vehicle for expressing our values. There are things we can do to make our democracy more functional, to make it, in my view, more representative, more egalitarian, more able to express the pluralism of the country. But we're not going to do them until we adopt a little bit of the audacity that the Founding Fathers have, or had. Ignore more or less everything about them. But that is what we should adopt. That's why the Founding Fathers matter. As an example of what we ought to be doing if we are serious about changing this country's politics for the better.